Good morning. This is Joshua Talasis. I am a representative for Team New Zealand, and today we will be talking about cybersecurity risk assessment. In the next slide, we will be going over the agenda for today. The first topic we will visit is risk assessment. Essentially, what is a risk assessment and why it is important? Following that, we will discuss some of the threat vectors associated with Team New Zealand, as well as the vulnerabilities discovered during our assessment. We will briefly discuss authentication, authorization, and access control, as well as threats to organizational security, in particular visiting three different fields: people, technology, and policy. We will then share with you all New Zealand's vulnerability assessment matrix, as well as recommended solutions for each vulnerability discovered. As defined by NIST, risk assessments address the potential adverse impacts to organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, and the economic and national security interests of the United States, arising from the operation and use of information systems and information processed, stored, and transmitted by those systems. It is important to note that this is a standard international definition that is supported by New Zealand and other Five Eyes countries alike. A threat vector is a means of which an attacker will take to compromise a system or administer an attack. Threat vectors associated with Team New Zealand include, but not limited to, the following: social engineering, insider threat, attacks on mobile devices, attacks on uneducated users, unauthorized physical access, and botnet/Internet of Things attack on networks. In the next slide, we will discuss the vulnerabilities discovered associated with these threat vectors. Vulnerabilities discovered by Team New Zealand include the following: weak or bypassed access control, weak web server security and access control, mobile device access controls being compromised, weak telecommunications and network security, weak or neglected software and/or hardware firmware maintenance practices, weak physical security access control measures, and weak business continuity plan. These vulnerabilities will be discussed further in the presentation of New Zealand's Vulnerability Assessment Matrix. We will now go ahead and go over authentication, authorization, and access control. We will begin with authentication. Authentication occurs when a user successfully proves their identity in order to gain access to a service. Authentication should not be confused with identification. For example, identification occurs when a user claims their identity with identifiers such as a username or email address. The user must now prove they are who they say they are with the use of a password or other authentication method, and those methods or factors will be discussed in the next slide. Authentication is not limited to just users. Services, processes, workstations, and network devices all use a form of authentication to prove their identities. We will now go over the authentication factors that are used to prove an individual's identity. First, we will go over something you know. This includes a known password or personal identification number, also known as a PIN, or anything that a user may know in order to prove they are who they say they are. Next, you have something you have. This is something the user physically possesses, such as a smart card or USB token. So a smart card are often used with dual-factor authentication, which we will go over in a later slide, where users have something and know something, such as a password or PIN. Smart cards include embedded certificates used with digital signatures and encryption. Following something you have, there is something you are. This is especially used when implementing a biometric identification system. Types of biometric identification systems include fingerprint and retina scanning, and other unique biometric attributes. So additionally, you could have voice recognition systems as well as facial recognition systems. Somewhere you are takes into consideration the physical location of the user using geolocation technologies. And then lastly, you have something you do. This requires physical action to be performed by the user, such as gestures on a touch screen. We will now go over single-factor versus multi-factor authentication. Single-factor authentication requires the user to satisfy only one of the authentication factors presented in the previous slide in order to prove their identity. For example, when a user provides a username coupled with a password, the password represents something you know factor is being implemented. Multi-factor authentication requires the user to satisfy two or more different authentication factors to prove their identity. An example of this implementation would be requiring a user to provide a password, a something you know factor, as well as an authorized smart card, something you have factor. Authorization. Once a user has been authenticated, they may be authorized access to resources based on their identity. Specific system permissions are granted and assigned to each user. The practice of least privilege ensures that users have the appropriate level of access to organizational systems, nothing less, nothing more. This may be accomplished by implementing an authorization policy and access control. It is important to note that authentication verifies identity and enables authorization. But what is access control? Access control ensures that authenticated and authorized entities can access resources. This starts by ensuring that users are accurately identified and authenticated. Then access is granted using one of the following methods or models. We first have discretionary access control. This is where every object, such as a file or folder, has a owner, and that owner establishes the level of access for that particular object. Following that, we have mandatory access control. This implements the use of labels to determine access. Security admins assign labels to both subjects, also known as users, and objects. Subjects are granted access to objects when their labels match. We now have attribute-based access control. This evaluates attributes and grants access based on the value of those attributes. We have rule-based access control. This implements rules configured in systems such as routers and firewalls. It accomplishes this with the use of ACLs or access control lists. Lastly, we have role-based access control, where it uses roles to manage rights and permissions for users. Permissions are granted to specific roles, and those roles are then assigned to the appropriate users. With that being said, it is important to understand the organization's infrastructure in order to determine which model best fits the organization's needs. Now that we have briefly went over authentication, authorization, and access control, we'll go ahead and talk about organizational vulnerabilities. So, organizational vulnerability. There are many weaknesses and threat actors that may compromise an organization's security and should be considered, including people, technology, and policies. So we'll go ahead and start with people. Uneducated technology. For technology, the vulnerabilities faced by an organization may include misconfigured security devices such as firewalls, routers, and switches. There are rogue access points or unauthorized network access by external mobile users. There are also injection vulnerabilities, weak wireless security, buffer overflow, SQL injection, and embedded malware, a distributed denial of service attack, which we will visit later on in the vulnerability matrix, and sensitive data exposure. Next, we have policy. Policies can be too specific or not specific enough. Technology continues to evolve at a rapid rate. Policies must be modified in order to meet the demands presented in today's society. The relationship between organizational policies and laws may cause a dichotomy, in particular regarding privacy acts or privacy rights when a incident has occurred. Now that we have gone over the organizational vulnerabilities, we will visit the vulnerability matrix or vulnerability assessment matrix generated by Team New Zealand. As you can see in our vulnerability assessment matrix, we classified each threat type and threat vector as well as the vulnerability. We then scored the probability and impact using a scale of low, medium, and high. According to the matrix, the highest impact threat type is a data breach, and this is due to email and or social media phishing attack. The threat vectors include poor email practices, social media portals, and social engineering. So the probability is high and the impact is high as well. The reasoning behind this is most commonly used technique for obtaining access credentials, proprietary information, and personal identifiable information. In addition to scoring these vulnerabilities, we also provided some recommended solutions or options to improve framework security. As you can see through our matrix, there is an array of threat types that were discovered through this assessment, ranging from high to medium, and also low. One of the recommended solutions is to update current organizational policies, including password policy, acceptable use policies, and procedures to meet the requirements needed for secure business operation. It is also recommended to reassess policies periodically to ensure they remain relevant as new technology emerges. Implement multi-factor authentication for all critical systems and physical facilities, including remote access for remote users. Another recommendation is to reconfigure network firewalls to prohibit access for unauthorized devices. This may be accomplished by using implicit deny, in where everything that has not been approved or authorized is denied by default. Another recommendation is to implement practices to encourage the proper use of internal systems. Educate users of possible threats they may encounter and actions that may be taken to mitigate the risks of being exploited. Lastly, it is to log and audit network traffic to detect and address any discovered anomalies within the internal network. This may be accomplished with the use of tools such as an intrusion detection system and intrusion prevention system. So with those list of recommended solutions brings the end of our presentation. We would like to thank you all for listening to our cybersecurity assessment. So given the vulnerability matrix, we consolidated some recommended solutions to address these concerns. These are in fact one of the largest vulnerabilities. Users that are careless and or untrained on how to properly and securely use internal systems may unintentionally compromise the integrity of sensitive information. So to combat this, security-related awareness and training programs may help mitigate the risks posed by an uneducated user. So periodically implementing this practice will keep users aware of new threats and security trends. We now have insider threats. An insider is anyone who has legitimate access to an organization's internal systems and resources. Malicious insiders have a diverse set of motives and presents difficult security issues to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of assets. In addition, we have hackers, and there are a multitude of different types of hackers. There are script kiddies, typically known as novice hackers, who use existing computer scripts or code often copied on the internet to launch their attacks. We then have black hat hackers who are experienced hackers. They use their computer skills with malicious intent. Lastly, there are hacktivists. Hacktivists launch attacks as part of an activist movement or to further a specific cause.